You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling a vibe. Give thanks to the Father, I'm breathing alive.
Culture and Flavor is a podcast about food and culture centered in Black and Indigenous foodways, hosted by myself, Zella Palmer, right here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Each episode features high vibrational conversations with cultural bearers, chefs, farmers, scholars, barbecue pit masters, and more. Where there is flavor, there is history. Join me on Culture and Flavor and all of my guests as we share stories that will have you praise dancing, cooking, conjuring, and inspiring your culinary journey. Welcome to another episode of Culture and Flavor with your host, Zella Palmer. Today, y'all, I have a friend, colleague, comrade on this episode. DJ Lynnee Denise from Los Angeles, California is a DJ, a scholar, a historian, a time traveler, curator, fashionista, icon. She is, just brings the vibes every time I'm around her that heals our souls, brings us into a state of bliss and trance to remind us of our humanity. DJ Denise coined the phrase DJ scholarship to reposition the role of DJ from a party purveyor to an archivist, cultural custodian, and more. She's always transforming the way that we think about the music of the Black Atlantic and how we understand it beyond entertainment. DJ Lynnee lives and works between Amsterdam and London, but she is a global citizen. And her latest book, it was about a year or two. I think it was, how long was that ago was that? It was like right before COVID, I think.
2023 though. After.
2023. Why Willie Mae Thornton was a phenomenal book. And I'm always fangirling her, and I really wanted to bring her on this season of Culture and Flavor. We started the podcast this season with Tris, an amazing, I don't know if you all heard that sample, but I've been really into soca lately, specifically Jab Jab from Grenada, and Tris, who is a young artist from Grenada, allowed me to sample his music. So I just want to invite DJ Denise on here, and I want to bring the vibes because I'm in this Jab Jab mood. So welcome to Culture and Flavor.
Oh my God, thank you so much. I want to be honest and say that was one of the best introductions I've ever heard in my life.
Girl, that make me blush.
Thank you. Because it was like the real deal in terms of far from just a scholar and just a DJ. And you even threw fashion up in there. So thank you.
When you walk into the room, it's like, what you coming with?
I love it. And you know what? It really takes one to know one, because you know how you be out here styling and traveling and bringing stuff back from Morocco and showing out and showing up in New Orleans. Yes.
Too much. So I just wanted to start this conversation. I just wanted to kind of just go through genres of music. I'm just going to name some of my personal favorites. And I know we did a project together about the legacies of American slavery,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in music. And you created this bomb playlist on Spotify. I'm hoping I'll be able to share it with my listeners, but you curated this playlist that was just so fire. And you went from Negro spirituals to folk to bluegrass to so much more. But I'm just going to just put out, just mention some of the genres that I have on my playlist. I have so many playlists, and I'm always listening to your music because you are just a phenomenal DJ, and so many look up to you. But I just wanted to just kind of talk about Negro spirituals, the blues and Black women's role in that, jazz, house. In my mind, when I was thinking about this interview, I was like, okay, it's bigger than hip hop, soul, neo-soul, folk, bluegrass, soca, calypso, jab jab, reggae, dancehall, samba, salsa, timba, reggaeton, son, guaguancó, rumba, the 80s that raised us, Sade, Prince, Michael Jackson, Africa, and we go into Africa, high life, Afro beats, amapiano, music from Mali, Senegal, Morocco, and then even the spiritual kind of grounding artists, new artists that I've been like really vibing to, a Chantress Siba, and listening to, kind of Icaros music from Peru. So I just want to like go and dig in the crates with you. What you got going on in the crates now?
Oh my God. You know what you just did? You gave me that feeling that I got when Samuel Jackson was playing that DJ and Do the Right Thing, and he does this bomb, amazing black music roll call, and he's naming Phyllis Hyman and Betty Carter and John Lee Hooker, Public Enemy. So I love that you did that with genre. So I am spending a lot of time with disco, which is interesting, and what is being called disco, I should say, because much of what is called disco is really like just a kind of like up tempo soul or funk. But I've been listening to a lot of Sylvester, and I've been thinking also about Jamaican dub,
Mm.
because there's a relationship between what these Jamaicans, producers were doing and DJs were doing in the studio, and what DJs during the disco era were doing in the studio. Like they were both really pushing technology. So those are two genres of music. I'm always thinking about the blues. I'm always thinking about Black women in jazz. And so, Betty Carter's on my mind a lot, Mary Lou Williams, Dorothy Ashby, Alice Coltrane. Um, and you know what else? May we please pause and say Roberta Flack.
Yes, we must. Yes, we
Yeah,
must. Yes, we
Roberta
must.
Flack and Angie Stone and Dwayne Higgins and Frankie Beverly, and
Mhm.
how New Orleans responded to Frankie Beverly's passing. So I'm just always thinking about the kind of social cultural context of Black music and genre and people who create these sounds.
Mm. So for our listeners who aren't familiar with your work, what led you I'm sure music was always with you, but what led you to become a DJ, and just talk about just a little bit of you growing up in LA?
Mm. Yeah, I've been thinking about this too because in my bio it says something like raised by my parents' record collection, but there's some real truth to that, because LA is the site for a lot of activity in the 80s that many of us would choose to kind of forget because it's connected to a lot of heartache around this Reagan era and the dismantling of social programs and the introduction of crack cocaine, the criminalization of addiction, the mass incarceration, industrial complex that expanded during that time. But what strikes me always as a kind of way to remap is thinking about all these other forms of Black music that were created during that time. And that's hip hop, that's dance hall, that's house, that's Black techno from Detroit, that's some of the, some of the sort of kwaito or bubblegum music coming out of South Africa. And so I think that growing up was very interesting in that I had constant exposure to kind of like Black musical genius, fashion and everything, but then also watching how Reagan's policies impacted my neighborhood, my family, my home. And
Mhm.
so, but there was always music playing, in my home.
Mhm.
So, and my parents took listening to music seriously. They took caring for their records seriously. And I just simply walked away with those same skills and passion.
Man, you talking about the vinyl collection. I think every of a certain age bracket, anyone who grew up in a Black household, those vinyl collections were serious.
Yes, their archives.
They're archives, and it's just like you knew. Like I can remember my dad. Like I knew it was like kids needed to be there, have their butts in bed, and close their door because once he put that Marvin Gaye on or the Stylistics.
Okay, now you got the stylistics now, and the dramatics,
What?
man.
Girl,
Like
you better.
Love Train. Who is that? If you have that special lover. Who
Oh
is that?
man. I can't remember it.
I think that is a stylistic.
No, I don't
Yes.
think that's just.
Oh.
They my parents were married in front of our fireplace in our home, and I remember their song was "You Make Me Feel Brand
Oh
New."
yeah, come on. Yes. Yes.
Ah, that was their song, and so
Mm.
my dad would be like, "Alice, it's time to go to bed. I put the
Uh-oh.
vinyl on."
Uh-oh. That reminds me of an infomercial from the 70s. Like, oh no, brother, you got to get your own, you know? The
But
the way that black people act when the vinyl come out. Mhm.
man, but you know, the tangible, and I just want to even just talk to the younger generation who might not be familiar with what it
Mhm.
meant to like
Mhm.
go to the mall or the local record shop and go through those crates, and just the whole experience between this album and the time. I just remember just looking at the vinyl album and the cover, and I would read every word on there, and
Mhm.
the graphic designs. I mean, it was a whole
Mhm.
experience.
Mhm. Yes, that's actually the work. When I coined DJ scholarship, I was thinking about the importance of album covers, as a kind of evidence of kind of a like black musical visual culture. So, I'm always thinking about Parliament Funkadelic album covers and Earth, Wind and Fire and Ohio
Mm,
Players. Um, and even the simple ones like Sade's
mm,
face, how elegant those album covers were and how they made sense for her sound. Not too
mhm,
much, just a ponytail and a red lip. And then the album would be on repeat.
mhm,
And so, yes. And then the liner notes, these are real important political spaces, and I would go as far as saying a sort of a certified genre of literature that's part of a black literary tradition. And so I am of the school of the Amiri Barakas, who believed that it was the duty of black people to write the narrative around the music, because he was aware that oftentimes these biographies on blues musicians and so-called like black American folk music and jazz musicians were oftentimes written by white men who weren't willing to ask harder questions about how this music came to be.
Since you mentioned the blues, let's talk about the blues.
Okay.
Your book, it's so phenomenal. I
Thank
interviewed
you.
you previously about that, but I would love for you to talk about why Willie Mae Thornton matters.
Mm,
I grew up we talked about this before, but I know y'all tired of hearing that, but I'm always represent the South Side of Chicago.
yeah. I'm never
But
tired of it.
okay. So I grew up in that kind of that
Mm-hmm.
axial point when the I still saw blues musicians on the corner, from Mississippi, from Arkansas, from all the Alabama, still playing in what we call Jewtown, which was like this, Maxwell Street, where people could buy, cheap clothes before there were dollar store or Walmart. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and if you've seen the Blues Brothers film, that was real. I can remember being very young and going with my dad to the tailor shop to get, his suit tailored and one of the local tailors. So for me, blues, I mean, Chicago has a huge blues fest, but it
Mm-hmm.
did, blues has, as you said, been, has changed, has not, the people who aren't able to tell their stories aren't here anymore. And then, the historians who do kind of tell these stories come from a very different vantage point. So I would love for you as a scholar to talk about why blues matters
Mm-hmm.
and why Black women in blues in particular, like Willie Mae, matters most of all.
Mm. And see, that's a huge question, but I love that you started with Chicago and basically demonstrating the fact that blues is a migratory music, that is oftentimes cited as starting in Mississippi and the Delta area, which makes sense. I think that there are a number of blues scholars that maybe are poets or novelists, and these are folks who I would say, are along the lines of like, you know, um, I'm thinking of just like along the lines of Langston Hughes and Richard Wright and Sterling Brown, and then later on down the line, Angela Davis, right? So there's been a long-standing history of Black folks across disciplines thinking about blues critically. And so when I wrote my book, I was able to call on those folks and to call on that work, to kind of learn about how to frame this woman's life, Willie Mae Thornton. And so I think that first and foremost, I understand blues in the tradition of how Clyde Woods describes it as being a music that comes with a kind of built in social critique, right? That it's a form of music that is sort of, that emerges after the so-called emancipation of enslaved people. The first witnesses of so-called freedom are the folks who are responsible for introducing, blues into the sort of American vocabulary. So I think that it is a form of music that has always responded to social issues, whether we're talking about climate disasters like the Mississippi flood in 1927, the disaster of the prison industrial complex, which the blues in the 19th century was responding to, the celebration of a kind of decadence around alcohol and, tobacco, the role of, as I said, migration and the train and the number of blues songs that refer to traveling and traveling by train and traveling by foot. But I think that one thing is important to remember, which is that the first blues song was recorded by a Black woman,
Hmm.
and that it is Black women who becomes the kind of mouthpiece for Black folks who are experiencing this new but obviously violently conditional thing called freedom. And so you're thinking about, like, the vaudeville era in the 1920s, and even the Harlem Renaissance in the 1930s, and artists like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith and um Gladys Bentley. And then it's also not even just Black women, but these women were oftentimes openly queer. And so the blues in itself is a kind of articulation of Black folks as a collective, community of queer beings. And I am not talking about sexuality per se, but queer in this sort of white, cis, heteropatriarchal society that has found a new way to use the labor of Black folks, that went from using the physical labor to using the sort of vocal labor, and building a similar music industry around the blues that kind of, models a plantation industry. So I think that, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, all of these places have their own brand of blues. And because that's what Black folks do, we localize, right? Like, we localize the music to fit the conditions of these places, that we make home in, and have to make home through how we, envision and understand sound.
Hmm. So, since you mentioned, um, just kind of shaping how we respond to sound, there's so much intersectionality in Black culture and in a culture that we created here in the Americas, right? And when I think about just recently, the James Beard Foundation gave Lim's Barbecue the American Classic Award, Lim's Barbecue in Chicago, a staple in the barbecue world, and they created this barbecue pit on an open pit in the bitter cold of Chicago, but still were able to transform and still cook and make barbecue the way that, not the way that they were doing in Mississippi, but make it to adapt to this brutal cold weather in Chicago. And the same thing when you were talking about, just how the using technology and brothers were in New York, breaking, doing all of these things. Um, and I think about Black music as also being very telling about the food that we eat. When we go back to like, James Brown, and he's talking about pass the peas and eating smothered snake, and he's Gullah Geechee man, and then we fast forward to Meek Mill, and he's talking about, oodles and noodles babies. It's very telling about what we're eating. And I would love for you to kind of just take us through, especially since you're even in the disco era, and into that right now. I would love to just get your idea about the intersectionality between food and Black music.
Ooh, and I think we discussed this before, and it really excited me then, just because you do so much, awesome work in New Orleans around, everything from red beans to gumbo, and so I mean, first and foremost, I'm thinking about what it felt like to be writing this book on Willie Mae Thornton, and to hear songs that would, towards the end, entirely break out and become a sort of love, a love letter to some of her favorite food, you know? And so she was like ham hocks and cornbread and buttermilk and right, like a love letter to these things that we associate with home, and very particularly when we are away from home. So food becomes also part of the archive. Food is about, honoring the memory of our families, and thinking through ways that we can retain our identity even as we change and transform through movement. But I'm thinking about Jill Scott and her relationship with food on the record. Carlos Santana with just like, beans, greens, and bread, and there's just, yes, there's a deep history of Black folks talking about the kind of food they had, the kind of food they didn't have, the kind of food they wanted, the kind of food they're going to make when they get home. So food is very much so part of a Black lived experience that we feel like is important enough to highlight in lyrics.
Mhm. I think it's also, I think it's also spiritual too.
Hmm.
When you
Hmm.
talk about, I was thinking about John Lee Hooker and some of the early blue, and even, some Black women in blues. I mean, Ma Rainey, all,
Hmm.
and bringing it back. And they were always through talking about that mojo.
Yes. If you
The
scan
mojo.
the word mojo in Black music, you would probably see that word over 1,000 times.
So, and that's my point, is like, it was
Mhm,
real, and we have to listen to, and you, on as a DJ are like hearing and spending, so much time and engaging with this music and time traveling and listening to their words. How does spirituality, and just you as a DJ kind of listening to old Negro spirituals, blues, and even moving forward, where are we trying to find ourselves in this kind of world that wasn't created for us, but was
mhm.
created by us?
Mm. So I'm a graduate of Fisk University. And so those Jubilee singers were, I mean, we had to learn the history of, and then also, Du Bois is a son of Fisk. And so we had to study these sorrow songs. And so when I think about sorrow songs and old Negro spirituals and the faith it took to believe you were going to make it on the other side of a day after being brutalized and turned away from your families, and dehumanized. And so music is the place where we got to exercise our humanity. And I think that remains, right? Because I think that one of the things that Clyde Woods, who's this blues scholar, argues is that in the same way that the plantation model has been adapted and sort of re envisioned, so too has the blues. And so he argues that all of these forms of music, contemporary forms of music, have a blues based ethos. And I think that ethos comes with a deep faith and belief during moments of sort of deep impossibility, like, so, and I keep thinking about New Orleans because I'm like, all of the music that came out after, not all, but so much of the music that came out after Hurricane Katrina that gets referenced in different genres of music in New Orleans, and then New Orleans having this deep, deep and rich spiritual history and these spiritual traditions that evoke and invoke all kinds of ancestral memory and drums, and so I think that places where you live in particular are so spiritually charged. And so it doesn't surprise me that people can gather with hundreds walking down the street carrying a body and celebrating through a second line. Like, so, because that's who we are calling on. That is who we've called on traditionally, our different understandings of God and sort of spiritual guides and ancestors to help us through in this place that we call life.
And by the time this episode comes out, Mardi Gras just ended, and it had me thinking. One of my former students who was on a previous episode and season, Chipo Kandaki.
Yes.
Yes, I don't know if you all saw her, but I mean, she just came out for the first time as a queen for the Mardi Gras Indian tribe here.
Oh.
And I mean, wow. I just was blown away. And she is a music lover. She started Femme Funk
Mm-hmm.
and when she was at Dillard, and she's all in the funk, and so just to see her become a queen and just that evolution, and to know that she's going to add so much value to the culture, is mind blowing, because I love to see the youth, taking the torch and understanding, and so grounded in not only the past, but knowing that they're going to add tremendous value to the future.
Yeah, but she makes these explicit links between, whatever, like music in Brazil and movement in Brazil and like movement in Miami. And then she'll take you to the 90s and give you like a professional demonstration of twerking and removing the kind of, respectability politics and rhetoric that sometimes surrounds these dances and the shaming that happens. She does really amazing work to re-narrate, like these dances that are associated, interestingly enough, with like Black working class people. And
Mm,
so I really appreciate her. She has a great lens, and her analytical lens is her actual body.
that part. That
Mhm.
part. If you all haven't seen her, say my listeners, definitely look her up. She's done a lot of reels and just educating folks on different dances, different, cultural genres and music. And like DJ Lynnee Denise said, she is really part of this, I believe, futurism for these young people that are doing incredible work.
For
Uh,
sure.
for sure. For sure. And so I want to, since you travel a lot and you live abroad, one of the things that always kind of, just touches me and gets me all teary eyed,
Mm,
because a lot of times, and due to, savage capitalism and, the consumerism and all of these things, when we create genres of music
mm,
or whatever, if it's not popular, or if we don't have or previously, I would say, if the music industry didn't sign us, then a lot of times things would die,
mhm,
and but when you go to other countries, I was in South Africa, and you were recently in South Africa for your
mhm,
birthday, if I'm not mistaken.
mhm,
And you know, just the conversations that you have with people abroad, and just their eyes light up about our music and culture. And I find that so heartwarming to be seen, and that you appreciate music that we stopped listening to, that we sometimes don't hear anymore.
mm,
And you have questions, and you have insight, and we have these amazing conversations. And
mhm,
it makes me just, proud many times to be a part of this legacy, this long lineage of folks,
mhm.
who have created as something in spite of all the challenges that we have had. on this land?
I mean, you know what? There's an update. I think you announced that I live between Amsterdam and London, but the thing is, I left London because it's
Oh, my apologies.
yeah, no, but I love that you said it because I mean, I'm on my way to London next week. I mean, I'm getting my PhD from London. I lived there for
Yay!
multiple years, and so, but I moved because it's a place that one cannot necessarily afford to
Mm,
live alone as an artist. But well, I guess maybe to do a full circle, but I moved to London and I'm working on a PhD that includes a chapter on Black British music and cinema, right? That includes a chapter on South African kwaito and bubblegum music and house music. And so I moved to South Africa, quite honestly, because I have been deeply in love with South African jazz and South African electronic music and traditional South African music. In when January 2024, I moved there. And so I've been doing work like collaborating with DJs in South Africa and doing these kind of exchanges about Black American jazz and South African jazz, and then learning about the crossover, connections like the friendship between Miriam Makeba and Nina Simone,
mm,
or even like the fact that Hugh Masekela from South Africa, when he first came to the US, he lived with Dizzy Gillespie,
mm,
and was learning tricks of the trade from Dizzy, on that trumpet, Letumbulu, just so many people that represent this diasporic dialogue that has been happening between Black America and Black South Africa for decades. And it obviously extends beyond music, right? It's the engagement of literature as well as music. So being over there and having conversations with folks and kind of decentering Black American music and rather listening to it as a part of a chorus of diasporic music, right? And but at the same time, yes, Black American music wherever I go, Jamaica, London, South Africa, is something that many people know and refer to and have memorized and have love for. But I think the thing that makes me sad is that we don't necessarily have those relationships with South African musicians, with maybe Jamaicans we do because reggae is a little more prominent, but other parts of the diaspora, like. And so the big question for me is why. And the truth about it is kind of sad, right? Because it's about American imperialism. It's about who can be on the radio in South Africa, who can be on the radio in, Barbados, who can be on the radio in Suriname. That's a part of the diaspora. And usually that's Black Americans. And usually that's because of the corporate machines behind their work. But that is not to say that Black Americans benefit from that financially, right? Obviously, one of the things that Angie Stone talked about before she passed was like how much royalty she was owed. And yet her music could be heard all over the world.
mm.
So, yeah.
I mean, when I think about uh just okay, let me ask you this question then. W- Do you think that that is changing because of social media? Do you
Mhm.
think that we are now more connected with Africa and the Caribbean than we have ever been before? Because when I look at like my parents' generation, the 60s, 70s, and
Mm,
it was such
good
a
point. Mhm.
a huge transfer of information between the continent, between the Caribbean, and it was, largely to do with the music and print media,
Totally.
and
Mhm.
activism of the time. Is there an exchange happening now? And are we headed towards an even bigger exchange of culture and information?
I love that. So I think that those exchanges have, you're right, always happened. But I think more so on a, what do you call that? Underground scale, like, but I think that you're right in terms of social media making it possible for us to cross borders just by listening. But in terms of, do I think that I'm going to turn to Hot 97 and hear like South African music here. I don't think so. Like I think that those circuits or those networks of connection will largely be underground.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you consider you know, like someone like a Tyler from South Africa who got a Grammy, and she's like among one of the first, like, there's this world music category, but it's just deep because it's like America continues to center itself. And so making Black music commercially available to the world is something that they have the corporate might to do. But to your point, yes, underground through social media, we are finding ways to connect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, we'll be back after a few messages. This first half was amazing, y'all. I hope you tune in. I hope you subscribe. I hope you share with a friend. I hope you have your own conversations. I hope DJ Lynnee Denise shares some of her playlists, and I'm going to ask her in the end of the podcast just some of the you know maybe some artists that she wants to share that we should be on the lookout for. But we'll be back after a few messages. Thanks for tuning in to Culture and Flavor.
This episode is brought to you by Plugra European-style butter, crafted for those who demand precision and exceptional results in the kitchen. With 82% butter fat and a slow churn process, Plugra gives you flakier crusts, fluffier cakes, and rich, melt-in-your-mouth pastries. Because great baking starts with great butter. Unlike standard American butters, which have only 80% butter fat, Plugra ensures the ideal moisture and fat balance so your recipes turn out just right every time. That's why professional chefs trust Plugra and home bakers love it. Plugra's slow churn process creates a smooth, creamy butter that gives dough a soft, pliable texture, making rolling, folding, and laminating effortless. Whether you're perfecting a buttery pie crust or layering a delicate croissant, Plugra helps you bake with confidence. Experience the difference for yourself. Find Plugra in stores near you or visit plugra.com. That's Plugra.com.
All right, we're back. So we talked about travel, we talked about the blues, we talked about food and music. I kind of want to now pivot the conversation to music and activism.
Mm-hmm.
And just where we are in this time period as far as kind of sometimes a desensitized genre. I mean, not genre, I'm sorry, a desensitized nation that's so numb because we have so many things that are coming at us constantly that we can't focus on one thing, and we have so many distractions. But when you listen to the music from the beginning, there was always this sense of activism and sense of a call for liberation all over the globe in the Black Atlantic. And I would love for you to just kind of talk about your thoughts about music and activism.
Yeah, I mean, we can even start with like a Bob Marley and reggae in general. Bob is an easy go-to, but I think reggae is a great example of a history of, I don't even know if I want to say activism as much as I want to say consciousness.
Mm,
In the Jamaican context, and some of the lyrics that refuse to forget slavery, right? And having songs like "Do You Remember the Days of Slavery?" and songs about like Garvey's ghost, right? So then those kinds of commitments to remembering when the memory is under assault feels like a kind of activism to me. But then
mm,
you have folks who really are doing, or who were rather doing serious activist work like Nina Simone. And by activist work, I mean that she would donate her services as a musician to help fundraise for marches, right? But then even the activism that happened right after disco in the 1980s with this like house music community that would do things like have parties to organize to be able to pay for people's funerals who were dying of AIDS, right? That
mhm,
too is a kind of activism. It's the activism that comes with the fact that in 1965, and between like 1965 and 1970, there was a massive radical Black jazz movement with folks like Yusef Lateef, and Art Blakey and Don Cherry and Max Roach, right? And so that was like a major kind of way to think about Black freedom. And in fact, I'm sorry that I did not mention Abby Lincoln. Like, how dare I?
Abby Lincoln. Come on now with Abby Lincoln. If you all don't know who Abby Lincoln is, please listen to Abby Lincoln. She was actually in the archives here at Dillard. She, actually a lot of people, the New Orleans Jazz Fest, the brainchild of it, a lot of it came from students organizing and starting a jazz fest back in the day in the 60s, right here, in New Orleans at Dillard. So, and and just even thinking about frequency, um, and that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, the frequency of music and sound. There is such an intentional policy law outlawing Black and Indigenous folks from hearing the drums, and then we listened to jazz, this beautiful art form that came about that was so complex. I mean, John Coltrane, traveled the stars with his wife Alice. They're cosmic as far as I'm concerned. And then you go to some 808, and then some of the other music into hip hop, and then some of the music industry pushing for more music that brought that encouraged a lot of violence. And so I would love for you to just talk about the sound and frequency in music, and Black music in particular.
That's a powerful question. And I'm not an engineer, but yet I want to talk about the way that Black people use maybe techniques to achieve a certain kind of sonic aesthetic. And so one thing that comes to mind is the use of echoes, in Black music, the use of delay, the use of like dub to create spaces where silence becomes an actual form of music, and so I think because we have these interesting histories, pushing technology, frequency becomes an interesting place to investigate Black being. So I really appreciate that question. I will say this, right, about frequency. Here's the one thing, because you mentioned 808 machines. And one of the things that comes to mind, and you also mentioned this genre of music from South Africa, is a mapiano. Because when I think about a mapiano and what I witnessed when I was living in London, or when I would travel to Paris, or when I'm here in Amsterdam, and also certainly in South Africa, something happens to Black people when they hear how low that bass can go in a mapiano. In terms of frequency, not in my lifetime, have I ever heard bass that drops beneath the sound of the 808, to the point where I have witnessed and even experienced the speakers not know what to do because the bass is so unruly. It refuses to behave with the technology that was designed to read bass. And so it's not surprising to me that more than any other music in South Africa, to be honest, like more than Kwaito, very few people have heard of Kwaito. Very few people have listened to South African jazz. Very few people have listened to it at home. But when you say a mapiano, there are mapiano parties in Berlin. There are mapiano parties in LA. There are mapiano parties in London. There are mapiano parties here in Amsterdam. Something is happening with the frequency there that's calling attention to the diaspora, and is coming through this lower level of bass.
I say, I need you to invite me to one of so I can get on this plane, because I want to feel that bass, honey.
That bass is something I have never seen. I said, and I learned about mapiano during the pandemic, and I'm telling you, I couldn't stop listening. I was listening to a mapiano, roots reggae, and jazz, because those three forms of Black music talk about frequency, and even all the breath work in jazz, all the sort of one drop slow funk in reggae, and then the frequencies and the push on technology from oftentimes young, unemployed, or underemployed young folks from the township creating these genres of music that are now like just summoning, like folks feel summoned by a Mapiano,
Mm.
and it's coming out of
Whew.
the township culture.
I'm for this past October, late October and November, I was in South Africa and Zimbabwe, and we have before your episode releases, we have 3 episodes, 3-part series from about 3 chefs and mischief makers, as they call, as Kuzai, one of chef Kuzai Pinga talks about. But it just
Mm-hmm.
struck me, just being in South Africa for the first time and just the landscape. I mean, as I walk away from that region, just I mean, I've been a lot of places, but it's something about that region that just like,
Exactly.
ooh, it's a
I'm so glad
portal.
you said the whole region, because Imbira music in Zimbabwe,
Mm-hmm.
Zamrock in Zambia. No, I'm so glad
Mm-hmm.
you said that region, Southern Africa. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, absolutely.
And, I think sometimes we in the States only get a sliver or
Exactly.
and then, the music industry chooses who they think will sell records.
Exactly. Exactly.
And it's really so I guess I would ask, how do we make sure that we filter out all of the advertisement, the ads, the buy this, support this, da da da, and find the underground, the base, the frequency. How do we do that?
I mean, but to your point, I think Instagram. Oh, I hate to say the names of these platforms in this day and age. I really do. But like SoundCloud, Podomatic, Bandcamp, there are ways to find these underground artists, but you got to be looking. But
Mhm,
they still are on these public platforms.
mhm.
And so these massive sort of corporate owned platforms, but somehow people are managing to figure it out. But like, here's an example of like a Mapiano. For like, it is nearly impossible to find a Mapiano on vinyl. It is such a new form of music that it is largely produced in digital form. Like, that's one of that's a real important kind of social phenomenon to think about, is format and place, because then that keeps a lot of artists underground. Right. So that means that you have to really be looking and asking and being curious about where these sounds are coming from.
What are some of your favorite DJs that you are really admiring now? Some of your colleagues that you are admiring? I know we have one that I admire here,
Mm.
DJ Antigone in New Orleans. I mean, he's a young DJ, but he's killing it, and just the
Oh,
vibes that he brings. I love to see, what he's doing for the
I love
city and
that.
just taking it outside.
I love that. Okay, well, I think about my favorite DJs in terms of place. So even thinking about DJ Soul Sister in New Orleans,
Mhm.
yeah,
Definitely.
and thinking about DJ Reborn, who, to your point, is from Chicago, but she is Lauren Hill's DJ. She's a friend of mine, but like, she is one of the first women DJs who I came across in San Francisco in the late '90s. There's DJ Remarkable from Detroit, who is also a producer. DJ Stacy Hotwax Hale is also from Detroit, and she is a house music pioneer, and very specifically not techno, because
Mm.
Detroit is more than techno. So those are some of the DJs that, then I have my go-to DJs and producers like Osunlade, a lot
Mhm.
of the DJs in South Africa, Moparisa, just even Uncle Waffles. There's a whole
Mhm.
new generation of women DJs, of queer DJs, of young DJs, right? So there are more voices that's
Mhm.
coming through the culture through this art form. So I appreciate it so much.
W How did you become a DJ? Did you just was it just from you living in LA and you like, I'm on a black club and, I'm on the block and I'm just gonna pull up and do a black club party? How
Yeah,
did
that's interesting. You know how I became a DJ is it started on the radio. It started at Fisk University because I was working at Blockbuster Music. Does anyone remember that? Blockbuster
Mm-hmm.
Music. I was working at Blockbuster Music, and I just started collecting CDs, and I just collected them because I loved them. But then I had like 60 CDs and a whole CD crate, and then I got into college and I took that crate with me, and then I heard about the radio station WFSK 88.1 FM at Fisk, and I went to the station manager. I was like, "Hey, I have music.
Mm.
Could you please let me do a show?" Then I was like, okay, well, how many shows can I do with just 60 CDs, And so then I started to learn about where the record stores were in Nashville. And I started to collect records and CDs and continue to buy tapes. And then, I was like, well, I'm interested in doing a show on all women funk artists from the 70s, the Shaka Khans, the LaBelles, the Betty Davis. Next week, I'm going to do a show on, Chicago early house for, checking out Trax Records and to see like, Mr. Fingers and all these folks. And so Jesse Saunders and, Ron Hardy and, and so it forced me, being a radio DJ, which is where I started, forced my collection to grow because I didn't want to run out of ideas. And so then that also
Mm.
forced my scholarship to grow because I was like, well, what if I want to do music from, all jazz women vocalists? Well, then let me listen to Ella Fitzgerald. Let me listen to Sarah Vine. Let me
Mm-hmm.
listen to Betty Carter. Let me listen to these people to hear. Let me listen to the Black women jazz instrumentalists like, Nina Simone is a pianist, but also Bobby Humphrey on the flute.
Mm.
So being a DJ at a Black college forced me to expand my understanding of what a DJ meant, and it really inspired the scholarship behind my practice.
And can we just even just talk about the aesthetic, the HBCU aesthetic, or parties, HBCU parties,
Mhm.
especially during that time? Because I see students sometimes trying to recreate the '90s. Younger people want to recreate the '90s. They dress like us. They've done so much, and I know that they're, adding their own and they're becoming their own culture. But
Mhm.
what was special about HBCUs and parties and music
Mhm.
back then?
Oh my God, I love that question because it brings up one of my favorite memories. What was special about Black, or rather HBCU parties in the 90s was like what would happen when music would come on from a certain person's city. So let me tell you who had the loudest voices. We're going to go right back. Chicago. Oh my God. If somebody played Percolator, oh, it was
Ooh,
over. It was
girl,
over.
you
These
should
Chicago
still play
kids,
that.
oh my God, these Chicago kids came. They told us how to make a hole in the floor and represent your set. Like it's time for and they waited for the music to shift and the fast movement and meanwhile I'm from LA. We crip walking. We're slower. We, like, so if we hear a little Snoop, we like, hey, that's my song. Chicago was like, boo, I was like, well, what's happening? Like, who's turned the music on? What is this up tempo sound? And I hated it. And
Ugh.
now I cannot get enough of it.
Listen, if you play the percolator to
Oh
anyone who is
Lord.
from Chicago, I don't care
Oh
what
Lord.
age they are. It's like, I don't
Mm-mm.
know, it's like a zombie call or
It
something. We just like,
is. It is. I couldn't believe it. I said, here they go. Here they go. And I mean, the hate, it was, I'm using that word way too lightly, but it was more so like, what is this thing about that I don't know about?
mm,
It wasn't like I hate the sound or anything. I was just like, what? They have their own private world, like
mm,
the Percolator
mm,
was something else. But and then also the New York kids, at the time, 90s, we're talking about like Wu-Tang, we're talking about
mhm,
Uptown Records, sadly, Bad Boys, unfortunately.
mm,
But like
mhm.
the Mary J stuff, but then also again, West Coast Tupac stuff, but then also the boy groups, the H Towns, the right. So in the Black college setting, people were happy to represent the places where they were from, and the DJs played on that.
Mm.
In the same way that they would be like, "What's your zodiac sign?" A
Mhm.
DJ would play a song and be like, "Detroit, where you at?" type of thing. Like so we got called to attention based on place.
I'm excited for whatever is to come because we continuously reinvent ourselves. So I'm excited
Mhm.
to whatever is to come. And even if it's coming from the continent, wherever is coming, we will hear the vibes.
For
And lately
sure.
I have been like deeply into soca. I mean, Grenada's jab music is
Mhm.
electrifying,
Oh, yay.
and I've never heard anything like that before. And it's same, that I'm a piano, even just being in South Africa and
Mhm.
hearing, and I wanted so bad while I was there to go to a party, but I didn't, I didn't get to a
Mm.
chance to go to one. So I'm hoping that at some point I can definitely just go to one and just be a fly on the wall,
Yeah, come when you come to South Africa next, call me in advance, text me in advance,
that I got
and
you.
I promise to take you to one of these township parties that I'm telling you, I don't party anymore at 50, but I'm trying to tell you,
I just want to stand
December
on the wall.
listen, December 18th, 2024, I could not leave.
mm,
I was at a
mm,
party for like 5 hours just sitting. I couldn't
yeah.
believe that every single song moved me deeply. I couldn't believe
Mm,
it. I couldn't
mm,
believe it. I looked up and it was 4 AM. And I don't
mm.
do that. I can't do that. I wish I could still do that. I can
Mm.
do it in South Africa.
And I see, that definitely, with Afrobeats artists,
Mhm.
there it's an exchange of like all of these genres, and it's just
Mhm.
the evolution of the Black Atlantic,
Mhm.
globally, and I love to see it. I love
Mhm.
to see it when I hear Afrobeats, a different, Wizkid or Davido, or Burna Boy,
Mhm.
playing with it, and then them playing with Afrobeats. It's an amazing time. It's
It
an amazing
is.
time.
It absolutely is. That's a great point because Afrobeat, like new Afrobeat, versus the Fela 70s, very talk about activists, political Afrobeats, and then the kind of new generation's twist on it. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's global, the Burna Boys and the absolutely.
And I also was thinking the other day about the magnitude of Sade.
Mm, mhm,
And I see some other young artists like Cleo Soul, Naomi Sharon, who are kind of, I would say, the daughters of her.
mhm,
And but then it also made me think about like there's so many amazing artists out there, but because the music industry is so lame now,
mm.
we don't have access to the Sades or the Prince. I don't think we'll ever have that again. Maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it may be gone, but
Yeah.
we still, I mean, and that's not to say, listen, there are people
That's
who
not to say
are
it's bad, but I just saying,
yeah, but that kind I don't know, I definitely do mourn. I feel like there's grief involved with the absence of Prince and Michael because of these things, because we know that there was one of them.
There was
Mhm.
nothing like Prince,
Nope.
growing up in that era, and
Mhm.
I'm praying. I thought Ava DuVernay was supposed to do a documentary about him. I don't know if she's still working on that, but I
Mm.
heard that. But I hope that someone does his story right because,
Mhm.
you know, I, for I'm a huge Prince fan. I don't play
Mhm.
about Prince,
Good. Mhm.
and Chef Sean Sherman is going to be on this season, and he's Minnesota, and you know Mecca and his partner Mecca, and just talking about Prince. I just want to just go to their restaurant, and I want to
Mm.
go to all the museums again. I think
Mhm.
a lot of folks have a Prince story, but to be part of that era and to have lived it and to have stayed up at night,
Mm.
listening to his music or
Mhm.
watching Purple Rain as a kid. What?
Mhm. No,
What?
absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mhm.
And I'm
Great.
just so grateful to be part of that. I'm so grateful that are doing this work and you're so important to
Thank
our
you.
work. And
Thank
I
you.
just, you're such a voice and I wanted to bring you back. I know, every year I got to just check in with you and bring
I'm
you on
always
someplace.
gonna say yes, so thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Mhm.
And the last thing I just want to, your Dochi, that was
Mhm.
a huge win. I mean, I love her. I
Yeah,
got to
me
say
too.
that.
Me
I
too.
love her.
Me
Yeah.
too. She is a force. She is pushing and also, quite honestly, the most exciting people in rap and hip hop right now to me are women. And so, like, but Doechii in particular, because I appreciate the fact that she is dark skinned, and we haven't, and this is after a legacy of folks like Cardi B, Nicki Minaj, and it's like the other thing that's refreshing is the shift in the face, after the Beyoncés it's just like, yeah, what are dark skinned women talking about? And I appreciate that the Megan Thee Stallions and so I just feel like there's a new era and a new kind of renaissance that she is one of the thought leaders around for sure. Super creative force and just authentic and, willing to take risk, bold, interesting, curious. Like it all comes through her lyrics. There's a lot of play, a lot of theater in her lyrics. She's amazing.
So to end this fabulous conversation, what are some artists that we should be listening to? Or who are some artists that we should be listening to?
Again, I'm obsessed with South African music, so I would say Thandiswa Masai, really an incredible artist and vocalist. I would say Zoe Madiga in South Africa. And I'm ashamed to say, I'm not ashamed at all to say, but I want to say honestly that I spent so much time in the history of the music. I would just recommend folks like Doechii, like that we've already discussed. And, so like, but I would tell people to revisit Sylvester. That's who I'm sitting with. And I think that there's a lot of attention around like Alice Coltrane. There's a museum that's doing an exhibition around her life. I think that's interesting. And so, yeah, I don't know, like new artists don't come up for me in the same way. And so I might not be the best judge for that. But I just would say like, my ear is on the streets to folks like Doechii for sure.
And I can't wait to read your dissertation and super
Yay.
congratulations. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining Culture and Flavor.
I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling a vibe. Give thanks to the Father, I'm breathing alive.
Culture and Flavor is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org.